Alright, welcome to U.S. History, Lesson 12, the beginning of the slave trade in the Americas. As the Native Americans began to die from diseases, mainly smallpox but other European diseases as well, the Europeans were looking for replacement for workers as slaves in their mines and plantations in the Americas. They thought Africans would be perfect because they were immune to European diseases, and African slaves were easy to obtain, as for centuries, losers of tribal wars and weaker tribes were enslaved by stronger tribes, and these slaves could be made for sale to anyone, including Europeans. Slave trade is one of the worst things in world history, and one of the worst things in American history. For centuries, Africans captured other Africans, and then they were sold to European traders in what is called triangular trade. And basically the trade is called triangular trade because the boats would leave from Europe filled with weapons, come to Africa, and weapons would be traded for slaves, and then the slaves would go across what is called the Middle Passage, which was a horrible, horrible journey where slaves were crammed underneath ships with terrible air, terrible ventilation, heat, misery, chained together, sometimes in shelves that were no more than 2.5 feet high. Crammed in there by the hundreds, sometimes by the thousands, and left to starve, suffer, and about 18% of them died across the trip. The trip across the ocean would last anywhere from 6 weeks to a couple of months. Then, after the Middle Passage was over, the slaves would arrive in the New World where they'd be auctioned off like animals and traded for tobacco, cotton, sugar, and other farm goods, which would go back to Europe where they'd be traded for weapons, and the whole trip would start again. So for about 200 years, the slave trade just kept going, and more slaves were brought to the New World. Millions of slaves brought to the New World. Most of them went to South and Central America, but about 600,000 went to what would become the United States. Like I said, conditions during the Middle Passage were horrible. Ships were tightly packed. People were chained together, often lying in their own filth. They were beaten. They were sometimes killed or thrown overboard. There was an incident where a captain of a ship wanted to collect his insurance for his cargo, which was the slaves, so he just threw many of the slaves overboard. Slaves were forced to dance for exercise. If they did not, they'd be beaten. Sometimes slaves tried to commit suicide by refusing to eat or trying to jump overboard. The slave traders quickly developed devices to prevent that from happening. They put nets on the side of their boat to prevent people from jumping overboard. They had a device where they actually plunged food down people's throats to keep them nourished that would survive the trip. Once they got to America, it wasn't much better. They would be auctioned off like animals, families divided, sent to do hard labor throughout different plantations and mines throughout the Americas, separated from their families, often horribly, horribly mistreated. This is called the African Diaspora, where the people of Africa were forcibly moved all over the world and spread out around the world, mainly to South America, the Caribbean, some to North America, a few to Europe, and some to the Middle East. Like I said, 600,000 went to what will become the United States, and all slaves were considered property by law. And of course, their children, this number multiplies because children born of slave parents would become slaves as well. There you have a slave auction, and just off to the highest bidder. Separating families, mothers from children, it was just horrible. Slaves often on plantations worked in the gang labor system where they worked in groups. We'll get into more into that in some of the later lessons. Although slavery was absolutely horrible, the culture from Africa that was brought to the Americas has benefited us a great deal. All types of different literature, folk tales, musical styles, religious styles, cooking, art, the list goes on, has migrated from Africa with the slaves and added to the richness of American culture. And of course that still has a large influence on America today as well. So kind of summing up the chapter overall, the chapter 2, the explorations, we have to see that the explorers were very brave, very determined. They had a wide vision to conquer and explore new things. Such courage should be admired, and it really is truly amazing. However, there's a negative side to all this. The European conquerors and explorers and European people that came to America brought with them tremendous cruelty to the Native Americans. They brought with them slavery from Africa. They brought with them a disregard for the environment that will lead to the destruction of the environment. So it's really a mix of positives and negatives, but it's definitely the foundation for what will become the United States. Thank you very much. I hope this was helpful.